The river moves quietly, but it carries a secret history soaked in fear and silver. In the year 921, an educated foreign witness stands frozen on its banks, watching chained women treated not as people, but as cargo. What he records will later be softened, minimized, almost erased. This is not a story of savage raids alone, but of an organized system that turned human lives into profit on an industrial scale. Tonight, we uncover what history tried to hide, what Viking slave traders really did to captured women, and why the world chose to forget. The witness at the river, he had crossed empires and deserts, yet nothing prepared him for what waited beside this river. What he saw was written carefully, then quietly buried by history. This was not chaos, not savagery, but a system. The year is 921 of the Common Era. The river is wide, slow, and cold, cutting through the forests of what is now central Russia, carrying trade, rumor, and human lives toward destinies already decided. By lamplight, an Arab emissary sits apart from a foreign camp, steadying his hand before committing words to parchment that he knows will disturb powerful readers. His name is Ahmad ibn Fadlan, a scholar and diplomat sent from Baghdad to observe distant peoples at the edge of the known world. He has witnessed executions, public punishments, and slave markets before. He believes he understands cruelty. But what unfolds before him on the banks of the Volga River forces him to confront something colder than violence normalization. The camp belongs to the Rus, the northern traders known in other lands as Vikings. Their longships are pulled onto the shore like resting beasts, heavy with cargo brought down from the Baltic forests. Furs, amber, honey, weapons, and something far more valuable. Women. Captured women. They are not hidden. They are arranged. Groups of 10 or 12 are linked together at the neck by iron collars, the chains heavy enough to punish movement, light enough to preserve the merchandise. Thin linen hangs from their bodies, useless against the river wind. Bruises mark arms and faces. Some skin bears symbols burned or cut into flesh signs of ownership, not identity. What arrests Ibn Fadlan is not only the condition of their bodies, but the condition of their faces. No pleading, no weeping. Only a blank stillness he recognizes instantly, the learned expression of people who understand that emotion invites pain. One woman draws his attention against his will. She sits slightly apart, constrained by the chain, but distant in some deeper way. Her hair is the color of old copper, her skin so pale that every mark stands out sharply, like ink spilled on parchment. She stares at the river with an intensity that suggests she is not seeing water at all, but a memory field's voices, a life that ended months ago. Ibn Fadlan will later learn fragments of her journey, taken from a Frankish settlement near the Rhine, carried by ship, and river, sold and resold, evaluated and reevaluated, passed through multiple hands like coin. She has traveled more than 2,000 miles without ever choosing a single step. Here, no one speaks her name. Names have no market value. What Ibn Fadlan begins to understand as he watches the routines of the camp unfold is that this is not an episode of excess. It is infrastructure. Guards rotate calmly. Traders check chains and count bodies with the same care they give to weighing silver. Food is distributed not to comfort, but to maintain strength. These women are not prisoners awaiting release or execution. They are inventory awaiting transport. The Vikings around them do not act with visible cruelty because cruelty is unnecessary. The system itself does the work. Fear has already been installed. Resistance has already been priced out. That night, as the camp settles and the river continues its slow, indifferent movement southward, Ibn Fadlan writes with deliberate restraint. He knows exaggeration would weaken his report, so he chooses precision instead. He records what he sees, how it functions, how calmly it operates. He does not yet describe everything. Some details he will only hint at, some he will return to later, some perhaps he will never fully commit to ink. But one truth is already clear to him, and it will shape everything that follows. The wealth of these northern traders is not built only on daring voyages or distant markets. It is built on a machine that turns human lives into profit with terrifying efficiency. And the woman by the river is only one piece of it. The harvest of bodies, the raids were not madness. They were mathematics. Every scream marked a calculation already made. Before chains were fitted, value was decided. What Ibn Fadlan could not see from the riverbank, but what the sources allow us to reconstruct, is the machinery that fed this camp long before the women arrived here. Viking raids were not spontaneous explosions of violence driven by bloodlust or chance. They were planned harvests. Routes were chosen years in advance, timed to seasons when rivers were navigable and defenses weakest, when monasteries stood full of wealth and villages held young bodies capable of surviving transport. Fear spread ahead of the ships like a shadow, but fear alone did not explain the precision. These raids followed logic. Greed refined it. Surprise completed it. When a longship approached a settlement at dawn, the warriors already knew what they were looking for. Gold and silver mattered, but people mattered more. Men of fighting age were dangerous and often killed. The elderly were burdens and frequently left behind. Children too young to endure the road were judged a loss. Women between adolescence and early adulthood were the prize. Their health, their appearance, their skills, even the way they moved under threat were assessed in seconds. Past belief offered no protection. Sacred ground did not slow the attack. Monasteries learned this lesson repeatedly, and still they were raided again, because they gathered exactly what the system demanded: undefended wealth and human lives. Capture happened fast. Survivors described hands like iron, bindings applied with practiced speed, captives linked together before shock could turn into resistance. The challenge was not taking prisoners, but taking the right ones. Raiders were trained to read bodies the way traders read scales. Strong teeth meant health. Calloused hands suggested labor skills. Clean speech hinted at education. Insecurity showed in trembling, and trembling could be exploited. Shock froze many long enough to be removed without a fight. Those who screamed were struck. Those who fought were made examples. The rest learned quickly that obedience preserved breath. Initial processing began almost immediately, often within hours of capture. Captives were gathered at coastal camps or fortified trading posts where their first transformation occurred. Clothing was stripped not for cruelty, but for inspection. Bodies were checked for illness, injury, or signs of pregnancy that might complicate sale. Groups were reorganized. Chains replaced ropes. Names disappeared. From this point forward, captives were not individuals, but units, counted and recorded according to destination. Some would be moved west to nearby markets. Others were marked, quietly, for the long eastern routes where profit was highest and survival least certain. It is here that the system reveals its cold intelligence. Not every captive was meant to live. Mortality was not an accident. It was accounted for. Traders knew how many bodies a route would consume through disease, exposure, and exhaustion. They loaded accordingly. 10% loss was acceptable. 20 was costly. 30 was disaster. Food was measured to maintain strength without waste. Punishment was calibrated to break will without damaging skin. Every decision balanced fear against value. Every act of violence served a purpose. For the women, this stage was the first realization that rescue was no longer a possibility. Past belief in ransom, mercy, or escape collapsed under repetition. Each sunrise brought movement further from home. Each night brought silence enforced by exhaustion. Curiosity about what lay ahead became terror when whispers circulated of distant markets, foreign tongues, and owners who would never know where these women came from. The future was a blank space, and blank spaces are where the mind breaks fastest. By the time the chains reached the river systems, resistance had already been thinned. What remained were survivors shaped by fear, conditioned by uncertainty, and prepared without yet knowing how to be reshaped again. The harvest was complete, the cargo was moving, and the most terrible part of the journey was still ahead. The breaking room's chains were only the beginning. Obedience was the real product. What could not be sold had to be reshaped. The worst violence left no visible wound. Beyond the riverbanks and longships existed places no saga celebrated and no monument marked. Rooms built not for worship or defense, but for transformation. These were the processing spaces, wooden halls near trading posts, enclosed yards behind markets, windowless chambers where time lost meaning. Here, captured women were prepared not to survive, but to sell. The system did not rely on constant brutality. It relied on method. Fear was introduced carefully, like a measured dose, never enough to kill, always enough to teach. The first lesson was isolation. Women were separated from anyone who spoke their language or shared their place of origin. Familiar voices create solidarity. Solidarity breeds resistance. Silence, by contrast, breeds dependence. Days passed without explanation. Orders came without context. Punishment followed confusion, and confusion became the rule. Hunger was used not to weaken the body, but to sharpen attention. When food arrived, it arrived unpredictably, tying obedience to relief. The mind learned faster than the flesh ever could. Next came instruction. Traders and handlers taught behaviors required by distant buyers, behaviors shaped by cultures the women had never seen. Eyes lowered, hands still, voices quiet, movements slow, curiosity punished, compliance rewarded. Those who adapted quickly were marked as valuable. Those who resisted were not beaten into submission all at once. They were worn down. Sleep was interrupted. Privacy was eliminated. The presence of constant observation turned even thought into a risk. Insecurity became permanent, and permanent insecurity breaks people more reliably than pain. Physical preparation followed, but it was precise. Bodies were cleaned, wounds concealed, hair styled. Any injury that might reduce value was treated just enough to disappear. Scars were hidden beneath garments. Weight lost during capture was restored through careful feeding. This was not care. It was investment. A woman who looked healthy commanded silver. A woman who looked broken did not. Greed dictated mercy, only where mercy paid. Some techniques are described obliquely in the sources, hinted at rather than detailed, as if the writers themselves hesitated to fully name what they witnessed or were told. What is clear is the intent. Resistance had to be erased without leaving evidence. Fear had to be internalized so that control would persist even in the absence of chains. The most valuable captives were those who appeared calm, compliant, and intact, carrying their terror quietly where no buyer could see it. For many women, this stage destroyed any remaining sense of past or future. Belief and identity dissolved when no one acknowledged it. Names vanished, time blurred. The mind adapted because adaptation was the only way to continue breathing. Some learned to perform obedience convincingly. Others retreated inward, becoming distant even from themselves. Both responses served the system equally well. What mattered was that the product moved smoothly to the next stage. When they were finally brought back into daylight, dressed and fed, their appearance betrayed nothing of what had occurred behind closed doors. To an observer, they looked improved. To the traders, they were ready. To themselves, they were something altered, carrying fear like a second spine. The breaking rooms had done their work. The chains would soon move again, and the river would carry them toward markets where silence was expected and humanity was negotiable. And beyond those markets lay destinations from which no account ever returned. The road that consumed the living, the river did not carry travelers. It carried survivors. Every mile forward erased someone behind. Not all cargo was expected to arrive. Once the processing was complete, the chains moved again, and with them began the longest and most lethal stage of the system, the journey east along routes designed not for mercy, but for profit. From the Baltic trading posts, captives were driven inland toward the great river arteries of Eastern Europe, dragged across portages where boats and bodies were, hauled overland between watersheds, then loaded once more onto vessels that would carry them south. The traders called it transport. The women experienced it as slow erasure. Exposure replaced confinement as the primary weapon. Open boats offered no shelter from sun, rain, or cold. Chains remained tight enough to prevent escape, heavy enough to ensure drowning if anyone fell into the water. This was intentional. Fear works best when consequences are visible. Disease moved through the coffles with quiet efficiency, spread by contaminated water and constant proximity, while exhaustion weakened bodies already reshaped by hunger and stress. Traders did not panic when someone fell ill. Loss was calculated. Mortality was not a failure of the system. It was a cost accounted for before departure. At every stop along the route, the captives were counted, not comforted. Those too weak to continue were sometimes abandoned, sometimes killed, sometimes simply unchained and left behind as the boats pushed off again. The riverbanks remember these places, even if history does not. Shallow graves. Bones scattered where camps once stood. The women learned quickly that survival depended not on strength alone, but on invisibility. To draw attention was to invite inspection, and inspection often ended the journey. Insecurity became instinct. Silence became armor. Curiosity about what lay ahead faded, replaced by the narrow focus of enduring the next hour, the next pull of the oar, the next night without shelter. As weeks turned into months, geography lost meaning. Forests blurred into marshland, marshland into open steppe. Languages around them changed. Faces changed. The traders rotated, but the chains did not. Past belief in rescue dissolved completely here. No one along the river claimed them. No village rose up in revolt. The world watched and moved on. Greed flowed downstream as steadily as the current linking distant cultures through human suffering. What began as a raid in Ireland or Francia now fed markets thousands of miles away, markets whose buyers would never see the river, never hear the coughing at night, never smell the sickness below deck. Those who survived to the lower reaches of the great rivers arrived transformed again, thinner, hardened, stripped of any illusion that the worst might already be behind them. Ahead lay places spoken of in fragments by the traders Bulgar, Kiev, cities where silver flowed freely and buyers were discerning. Survival no longer meant freedom. It meant reaching a point where one's fate would be decided with a gesture and a price. As the boats approached the great market centers, the chains were checked, garments adjusted, bodies washed as best as possible in the river itself. The final illusion was prepared. What had been consumed by the road was hidden. What remained would soon be displayed. And for those women who looked up at the unfamiliar skyline rising from the riverbanks, the realization came quietly and with devastating clarity. The journey had not been the punishment. It had been the preparation. The market of silence here, a human life was reduced to a glance and a gesture. Silver spoke louder than screams ever could. This was where the journey ended and vanished. The city that rose before them was Bulgar, one of the great crossroads of the medieval world, its markets humming with voices from lands the women had never known and would never be allowed to name. Traders from the north unloaded their cargo with practiced calm, guiding chained women through streets thick with incense, livestock, and the sound of bargaining, a sensory assault designed not to overwhelm buyers, but to normalize the presence of human merchandise among furs, spices, and metalwork. Before the sale, there was one final preparation, colder than anything that had come before. Bodies were washed in the river, hair combed and oiled, skin rubbed until it shone with health that had been carefully manufactured. Thin garments were replaced with fabrics chosen specifically to appeal to Eastern tastes, modest enough to signal obedience, revealing enough to advertise youth and physical condition. Jewelry was sometimes added, not as kindness, but as display, a visual promise of value. Injuries from the road were concealed. Weakness was masked. Fear was expected to be invisible. In the holding areas near the market, women sat in enforced stillness, coached one last time on how to lower their eyes, how to move only when commanded, how to appear calm while strangers decided their worth. Curiosity at this stage was dangerous. Surprise could be misread as defiance. Insecurity was survival. When the market opened, the transformation was complete. Buyers moved from bench to bench examining women, with the same detached attention given to livestock, checking teeth, skin, posture, opening garments without permission to assess what lay beneath. Conversation flowed above their heads in languages they could not understand, negotiations conducted as if the women were not present at all. The silence was deliberate. A woman who spoke out of turn lost value. A woman who flinched invited suspicion. Greed shaped every interaction. Traders praised obedience, emphasized training, hinted at skills learned during captivity, presenting trauma as refinement. Each sale ended with the exchange of silver and the transfer of ownership. The moment when one chain was removed, only to be replaced by another, lighter perhaps, but far more final. For the women, this was the moment when hope collapsed completely. Past belief in endurance as a path to return dissolved when the buyer stepped forward. Challenge ended here. No test remained to pass, no distance left to survive. Some were sold to merchants who would carry them further south to cities like Baghdad or Bukhara, where their lives would continue in households that would never record their names. Others were purchased by local elites, absorbed into domestic service or concubinage, their identities erased within a generation. A few were resold multiple times, their value shifting with age, obedience, and health. The market did not care which fate awaited them. It cared only that the transaction was complete. What makes this moment so difficult for historians to reconstruct is not a lack of sources, but their tone. Contemporary writers describe the market as orderly, prosperous, efficient. They recorded prices, routes, and profits with precision, while the human cost was compressed into a few careful lines. This was not because the suffering was invisible. It was because it was normal. The system functioned too well to inspire outrage among those who benefited from it. And so the women disappeared, not in secret, but in plain sight, absorbed into a world that counted silver more carefully than lives. As the market closed and the traders turned their attention back to the river and the next consignment, the benches emptied, the chains moved on, and history, once again, looked away. What the river remembered, civilizations are judged by what they celebrate and what they bury. This story survived only because someone wrote it down and looked away. The river carried more than trade. It carried truth. When the markets closed and the silver was counted, the system did not end. It simply became invisible. The women who survived the benches were absorbed into households, palaces, farms, and harems stretching from the forests of the north to the deserts of the south. Their lives continued, but their stories did not. History recorded outcomes, alliances, wealth, expansion, while the human cost dissolved into silence. Children were born who would never know their mothers' names. Bloodlines blended into populations that later generations would call native, pure, untouched. The past was not erased by accident. It was overwritten by success. What remains unsettling is how efficiently this disappearance occurred. No mass graves marked the trade routes. No public reckoning followed the profits. Instead, cities grew. Ships multiplied. Legends formed. The same culture that chained women by the neck also produced poetry, craftsmanship, and exploration that modern audiences admire. This contradiction is not unique to the Vikings. It is the signature of human civilization itself. Progress built on suffering rarely announces the cost. It normalizes it. It calls it necessary. Later historians struggled with this discomfort. Some minimized the scale. Others reframed the trade as a product of its time, an unavoidable feature of a harsher world. But the sources resist that comfort. Contemporary observers recognized the cruelty, even as they participated in the system. They described it clearly enough for us to understand exactly what was happening. What changed was not morality, but memory. Over centuries, the focus shifted to ships and sagas, to discovery and conquest, because those stories inspire pride rather than reflection. The women, by contrast, left little behind. They did not commission runstones. They did not write chronicles. Their lives were measured in service rendered, children born, obedience maintained. When they died, they were buried where they stood, often without markers, their origins known only to themselves. Archaeology occasionally recovers fragments of foreign jewelry in northern graves, DNA that speaks quietly of distant ancestry, but these are whispers, not narratives. They confirm what the written sources already tell us. The system worked. Too well. The most unsettling truth is not the brutality itself, but its familiarity. The mechanisms described here, capture, processing, transport, conditioning, sale, appear again and again across history, separated by centuries and continents, repeated with minor variations and the same results. Each time, participants convince themselves that this version is different, justified, temporary. Each time, the victims disappear into households and statistics, their suffering diluted by distance and time. The Viking slave trade was not an anomaly. It was a prototype. The river still flows. It passes through landscapes transformed beyond recognition, carrying no visible trace of what once moved along its surface in chains. But history is not erased by water. It waits. It survives in fragments, in uncomfortable accounts written by witnesses who did not benefit enough to forget what they saw. When we choose which past to celebrate and which to ignore, we are not just telling stories about long-dead people. We are revealing what we are willing to accept in ourselves. The copper-haired woman by the river never returned home. Neither did the thousands like her. They became the unseen foundation of wealth and legend, consumed by a system that required their silence to function. Remembering them does not undo what was done, but forgetting them ensures it will be done again, whenever profit demands it and memory looks away.